Hey guys, welcome to our Chapter 8 and 9 review. This is my second attempt at this. I tried to do the first one with my daughter in my lap, and she was great up until the video started. Then she lost her mind. Two on this. Give me a little bit of heads up. So I'm not sure when the school year is going to end. I wanted to at least get through chapters 8 and 9, which is what we're going to attempt to do today. I don't think this will be a very long video because I'm just going to highlight the things that I think you need. For instance, in chapter 8 deals with the federal courts, the judicial branch. We've already talked about the legislative and executive branches. So we're just going to discuss that. And what I mean by not worrying about all of this is that this is a pretty lengthy chapter, and it goes through excruciatingly important but long details about how our courtrooms are set up. Be honest with you, at one time, I had planned on taking us on a field trip to go and actually sit in and view an actual court of law and see how it is run and how it works, to give you guys a taste of that, because I used to work in the court system. And because of all of this, we're not able to do that. So I recommend, if you're interested in that stuff, to go and check that out, to go look at it, to go view that. Many courtrooms, they will let you just sit in and visit and watch. And it makes for a really interesting drama sometimes. Sometimes it's a little boring, a little slow. But like I said, I enjoyed it. I always had fun every single day that I was in court. There was always something that was worth watching, worth seeing. All right, so we're going to start in chapter 8. Like I said, we're not going to go through every single detail here, but I am going to give you all some basic information. I can never get my lighting right, so I'm going to try to turn this so that way the lights are not right on you guys. All right, so chapter 8, let's talk about the Constitution. So our judicial branch was set up in the Constitution in Article 3, Section 1. This was set in place during the first Congress, which met in 1789. Where they passed the Judicial Act of 1789. This was the first bill introduced in the Senate. So that'll probably be a quiz question. That was the first bill, which is the Judiciary Act of 1789. I want to apologize. My kids are screaming in the background, but this is life. I either record these at midnight or I do them and you guys just hear the girls in the background. So getting them to take naps has become an impossible act. So besides the position of Chief Justice, this act created 5 associate justices for the Supreme Court, 3 circuit courts, each consisting of 2 Supreme Court justices and 1 district court and 13 federal district courts. Okay, so I don't expect you to know all those numbers. I don't expect you to have all that memorized. The main thing I want you to understand is that the Judiciary Act of 1789 set up and established all of these things. Okay. By the way, again, all of this is coming straight from your textbooks, your American government textbook. So if you have any questions or if you're wondering where this is coming from, I'm not making this stuff up. It's coming straight from that. I'm highlighting the things that you all would have needed to know for your quizzes and for your tests in the future. There was one other note I wanted to make about that. Congress has empowered both the courts and the judges that sit on them to interpret the laws. That's really important because remember, we talked about the different branches of government. So the judicial branch, that is the part of the government that interprets the laws. Now that has become a much more powerful thing for them over the last few years, which is why every time a Supreme Court justice has been nominated, we see that there is so much more back and forth, a lot more political opinions that are being thrown about. So anyway, just want to make sure you guys understand that that's what the Constitution sets up the judicial branch for, is interpreting the laws, not making the laws, interpreting the laws. So, and I know I'm getting off on this. When you hear people talk about, like, for instance, issues such as Roe versus Wade, the most people, including myself, who are strict constitutionalists, which, by the way, I think Roe versus Wade was a terrible law that passed and should not have been passed, and it's not constitutional, and it needs to be reevaluated. The problem is that's not really supposed to be the job of the Supreme Court. They interpret it. They're not supposed to make those laws, which is why it was a bogus law to begin with. Okay, Congress has created 2 types of federal courts. I'm not going to break these down for you. I just need you to know these 2. There's 2 types of federal courts. There's the constitutional courts. And then there's the legislative courts. And again, I would spend a lot of time in class, maybe a whole day, explaining those 2. They're really complex. They're a little hard to understand. The main thing I want you guys to get is that there are 2 different types of federal courts: constitutional courts and legislative courts. That will be another quiz question. You guys are probably pretty familiar with the nomination process when it comes to a Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court justices, because we just lived through one of these, are chosen the same way as a federal judge. So if you guys ever, if you ever get to come across this question, you'll know this exact same thing. They're nominated first by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. Okay. It used to be, even in my own childhood, that when a president made one of these nominees, it was pretty much widely accepted. It was very much not highly contested. And these traditionally men, but also women, when they are nominated, they were usually accepted pretty quickly. Okay, that has been slowed down a lot by both sides. It's primarily, to be fair, it's primarily been a liberal issue the last few years to slow down this process. But like I said, to take that a step further and be fair, both sides are doing this now. Okay, you can make just as easy as it would be for me to make the argument. Okay, well, the Democratic side, they really slowed down the process, like in the last nominee of our Supreme Court justice, in the sense that they were checking some pretty outrageous or ideas based on that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but that's okay. They were exploring a lot of the background for each individual candidate. That's a new phenomenon. We haven't seen a lot of that throughout our American history. But on the flip side, when Obama was president, you may remember that the Republicans controlled the Senate and they refused to see any nominees. Now, there's some precedent for that you don't necessarily accept nominees during an election year. But it's still like both sides are guilty of politicizing this now. Okay. Civil and criminal cases. By the way, I don't know that any of that's going to be a quiz question for you. I just thought I would kind of give you all some background on that. That's where some of this debate occurs when it comes to the nomination of Supreme Court justices. Probably some of these courtroom types of terms you are very familiar with. In a civil case, there's two types of cases, basically. There's civil cases and then there's criminal cases. Okay. And it's pretty easy to tell the difference because in a civil case, you've got a plaintiff who is the person who's actually filing the lawsuit. Okay. And then there's the person who is, that's the person who feels that they have been wronged. And they were wronged by a defendant. And the defendant is the person who's actually named in the suit. And they are seeking to recover something of value. Usually it's monetary compensation or some sort of like change in the treatment from that defendant. Okay, so that's a civil. And it makes sense because it takes place between the civilians, okay, the people of this country. Okay. On the flip side, the other type of cases are criminal cases. And this is actually the courtroom that I used to work in were criminal cases. Mine were usually traffic oriented or cold checks or insurance issues, things like that, much more minor criminal cases. And the big difference here is that instead of the plaintiff being a person filing the lawsuit, the plaintiff is the government. The government is playing the part of the plaintiff, meaning that they are the one who are prosecuting. Okay. So anyway, those are the two differences there. Again, that's going to be another quiz question. So make sure you know that. Like I said, there's a whole lot more in this chapter. The only other thing though that I really wanted to talk about with you is the Supreme Court. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because I think that access to information for you all to view and figure out how like local law and criminal cases work, you can figure that out pretty quickly. You can actually attend that yourself. Most of you are not going to get the opportunity to walk into the Supreme Court and to view that personally. Okay, so the Supreme Court, we need to understand the Supreme Court is basically at the mercy of Congress. Congress is the one that they basically answer to. For example, Congress determines how many justices will serve in the Supreme Court. For a long time, that number had stayed the same. But since 1869, the court has had 8 associate justices. And that's in addition to the Chief Justice. Okay, so you guys are probably paying attention to the numbers. That gives us 9 Supreme Court justices. And the idea is, okay, well, if you've got some sort of split in the decision, typically, that number, because it's an odd number, it's giving you the opportunity to make a vote, and you're not going to have a tie. Okay, so that, like I said, that did change in 1869. when that was added to. The justices grant full review. Usually, the average is about 10,000 cases are going to come across the desks of the Supreme Court. They cannot and will not look at all 10,000 of those cases. They're not all at the level of priority. So what they do is they prioritize what they see as the cases that are the most important. And typically they get to about 100 of those cases a year. That doesn't sound like a lot out of the 100,000, but actually 100 cases is a pretty big workload to go through. If you look in your books, I know that many of y'all do not have your textbooks, but there have been 17 Supreme Court justices. Most of these names, when you look through them, you're not going to really remember them. I'm going to highlight a few of these names for you, though. So the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a guy by the name of John Jay. John Jay was appointed by George Washington, and he was the first guy. Okay, John Jay. Like I said, there's many others in here. Another important was John Marshall. And again, I'd love, if we were in class, I'd spend a lot of time talking about Marshall, why he's important, why he's significant. But we're not going to get into that today. But John Marshall he set a lot of the precedent for how the Supreme Court acts and sees cases and things like that. So you might want to look him up. Another kind of interesting one. He's not necessarily really important. He only served as Chief of Supreme Court Justice for 9 years. But a name you'll be familiar with is William Howard Taft. Taft was, of course, a president of the United States. In fact, he appointed Edward White to be the Supreme Court Chief of the Supreme Court Justice while he was president. But Taft actually went on himself after he became president and was not reelected. Taft himself decided, you know what, I would be a better Supreme Court Justice than a president. And he went on to become a Supreme Court Justice, and he served as the Chief Justice. So that's another name that you should know. So John Jay, John Marshall, William Howard Taft. And then just because we need to know who our Chief Supreme Court Justice, in fact, y'all should know a couple of the Supreme Court Justices anyway. But the one that I'm going to highlight for you guys is John G. Roberts, Jr. He is the Chief Supreme Court Justice today. He was appointed by George Bush Jr. In 2005. Okay, so that's all the information I'm going to have to require for you all for that section of the next part of your book. So if we're going to move to Chapter 9, then Chapter 9 goes over the Bill of Rights. I could spend a month just talking about the Bill of Rights. We're gonna knock all this out in about 5 minutes. Okay, so let's get right into it. So first of all, the Bill of Rights is a statement of an individual citizen's legal privileges, okay, which may not be taken away by the civil government. So the civil government cannot, based on the Bill of Rights, they cannot take these things away. This has been in the news a lot lately because obviously we're living in a pandemic, and the debate has arisen. What can the government tell us we can and can't do? Based on this precedent, they're not allowed to take any of these types of rights and freedoms away. They can make recommendations, or they can try to incentivize those who are living, trying to live outside. For instance, obviously there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about the right of petition, or the right of people to go out and to freely assemble, okay, to do those types of things. So there's a lot of debate about, okay, well, can people still do that stuff? Based on the Bill of Rights, they can. The question is of course, should they? Okay. Now we'll get into all that in a few minutes. And like I said, I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. The main thing that I want you guys to get as far as the establishment of the Bill of Rights is that it primarily comes from English constitutional history. You guys know that we spent quite a bit of time at the beginning of this book, at the beginning of this semester, talking about where we get our laws from. And that's highlighted in the Bill of Rights. That came from English tradition. We owe the English a lot when it comes to the establishment of our own rights, our own freedoms. Now, that was learned slowly and hardly in the United Kingdom and Great Britain, and we're grateful that our founding fathers were able to take those God-given rights and establish them for us. Now, there's some other places that this comes from as well, and I'm going to tell you should probably highlight this. There are 3 particular documents that give us our historical background for the Bill of Rights. Okay, The first one occurred in 1641, and it's the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Okay, I don't expect y'all to go back and reread these. I just need you to know these three. So the first one's Massachusetts Body of Liberties, and that was in 1641. The second one, which we alluded to a minute ago, was the English Bill of Rights, which was written in 1689. Okay, and then in 1776, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And it's these three documents that help us kind of find the formation of our own Bill of Rights. Okay. All right, I'm going to go through these amendments in the Bill of Rights. Like I said, I wish that I had a lot more time to go over this with you all, but I'm just going to basically tell you what the amendment says, and then we're going to move on. So that way you know exactly how to answer these quiz questions. All right, for Amendment 1, this is the one that if we were in class, you all would have to have memorized. You'd have to have from beginning to end memorized. It's not real long. I'm going to read it to you. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, this will give you an example of Mr. Mintzer's hypocrisy. When I was in college at WKU in my broadcasting classes, almost all of my classes required me to have this memorized for a quiz or a test or whatever. And you can see I'm reading it out of the book. I don't remember it. Okay, so just a really good example of one of those things where they made you cram something and it didn't stick. This is what I want you to get from this. Amendment 1 basically gives us three rights. Okay, we have the freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech. I'm sorry, did I say 3? I meant 4. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, which is why I confused that because I tie those together. So freedom of speech is the second one, freedom of the press is the third one, and then the right of petition. That's the fourth one. Okay, all righty. Like I said, I wish I had more time to go over this with you guys because there's lots of important things, lots of things that we could sit and actually debate, but we just don't have time to do that today. And again, that fourth one is the one that's really highly being talked about right now as far as the our ability to basically go out and to deal with our grievances with our government, to have demonstrations, that kind of a thing. Okay. All right. Amendment 2. This is some of you guys' favorite amendment. And I would argue it's the amendment that allows us to maintain the First Amendment. And that's the right to keep and bear arms. Now, we can spend, again, hours discussing this in class, but I just need you guys to know Amendment 2 deals with the right to keep and bear arms. That means that we're able to have guns and ammunition and weapons of defense. Now, there's, again, I know we don't have time to discuss this in class, and this is something I'm sure that Lacey or someone David might bring up, and we might spend hours discussing. But the main point of what most of us who are constitutionally driven, most of us interpret this as, okay, this was the founding fathers telling us that if there needed to be an uprising, if there needed to be a challenge to the government, in order to protect your basic freedoms, you would need to have this right. Okay, that was the thing that they feared at that time. Okay, so a lot of misunderstandings about that, but that's the primary thought behind it. Okay, Amendment 3. This deals with a quartering of soldiers in private houses. This might not seem really important to you all today because that doesn't sound like something that our government deals in. Keep in mind that when the founding fathers wrote the Bill of Rights, they were still off the fresh mindset of, it was very common in European countries, including Great Britain, to basically say, okay, these are our soldiers, this is our army, they need a place to live and stay, and by God, if we decide to stick them in your houses, we're going to do that. Okay, whether you like it or not. And the founding fathers had a big problem with this for lots of reasons, but the main reason, and this is what I want you to understand about this particular amendment, is that our founding fathers really cherished individual property rights. Okay, and so that's what that's kind of dealing with. So you might not think it applies to you today, but it does help establish, like, hey, you as an individual citizen, you have your right to protect and to maintain your own property. You don't have to house somebody because the government tells you to. All right, Amendment 4 deals with searches and seizures. This is basically the establishment of saying, okay, the government can't come into your home and search through your possessions, that there has to be a process for that. And so that's where they have to have a warrant to come into your home. And basically, again, like, this is to summarize, this is just to help you be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. Okay. All right. Amendment 3 deals with criminal proceedings. And Amendment 6 is like a continuation of criminal proceedings. That's really all I want you guys to know about Amendments 5 and 6. They deal with criminal proceedings, okay? Amendment 7 is similar in the sense that it deals with a jury trial, but it actually deals with civil cases. You guys may remember in civil cases, that's where you have not the government, but you have two individuals, defendant, plaintiff, who are talking about that type of stuff, okay? So that Amendment 7 is actually what deals with civil cases. Amendment 8 deals with excessive punishments, meaning that the government isn't capable or isn't supposed to like punish you before you. Basically, this is where we get like our bit of our innocent before proven guilty mentality. It deals with bails and things like that. Like I said, I wish I could spend more time on this, but we're trying to rush through this. Amendment 9 deals with the enumerated rights of the people. That's basically the overview of that one. I doubt there's going to be a question on that one on your quiz. Amendment 10 deals with the powers reserved to the states. And again, Amendment 10 is one of those often overlooked. It's not one of those when you ask people to say, hey, name for me an amendment you're familiar with. A lot of people don't talk about Amendment 10, but Amendment 10 is actually really important because it was just reestablishing that, that the writers of the Bill of Rights wanted to understand this principle of limited government. Okay, a limited government, that a federal government wasn't supposed to be in charge of everything. National government would not devour the state governments. And that was preserved in Amendment 10. Okay, this is where, and Amendment 10 is basically where you're going to get into the argument of federalism and anti-federalism. And keep in mind, even the early Federalists and anti-federalists, they're probably much more conservative than either the Republicans or Democrats today. You're seeing a much stronger push, especially in the world that we're living in, of the federal government's taking charge and being in control of things. It's one of the reasons I was a bit relieved when I saw President Trump say, okay, well, we're going to let the states decide when they can return back to regular work days during this pandemic. Okay. Amendment 11 deals with the suits against states. This is where if a state was filing a lawsuit against another state, that was dealt with in Amendment 11. Amendment 12 was dealing with the election of the president and the vice president. Basically, just saying that at that time that they were elected through separate ballots. Amendment 13 was you guys are probably familiar with this one's the getting rid of the slavery, abolition of slavery. We usually tie in the Emancipation Proclamation to this. But keep in mind, that was a war measure. It wasn't necessarily the amendment itself. That amendment didn't actually take place until 1865. Amendment 14, Civil Rights and Citizenship to Black Americans. It also dealt with some other issues when it comes to debt and disabilities and things like that. But the main point of Amendment 14 was that it was giving all men the opportunity to vote. Okay, and that included Black men as well. That took place in 1868, not too long after the Civil War. Amendment 15, right of suffrage for Black Americans. Let's see here. Did I say 14 gave them the right? Man, I am off a little bit. Because the Amendment 14 is just civil rights. I should say Amendment 15, which was signed in put into law in 1870. That's the suffrage for Black Americans. I just mixed up my amendment. Sorry about that, guys. I will clarify that on the quiz that I give you. Okay. And I guess, like I said, all this stuff is available to you guys online as well. Amendment 16 deals with income taxes. There are still libertarians out there who argue that this amendment should never take place. It's hard to imagine probably a world where income taxes don't exist. But keep in mind, this amendment was not signed into law until 1913. And basically, this just gave Congress the power to put taxes on personal incomes. Okay, that didn't exist until 1913. So it's just a little over 100 years old. Kind of amazing to think about. Amendment 17 deals with popular election of senators. You guys may remember we talked about senators for a long time were not voted by the states. That changed in 1913. Amendment 18 is where you get the prohibition, national prohibition. This is where alcohol was not allowed to be sold or made. Now that was repealed in 1933, so it didn't last very long. That was where the government said, yeah, it didn't work out real well for us. And if you look at your history, your Rebecca history books are really unfavorable. Like they're very big on okay, well, that should never have been repealed. I'm gonna tell you, your teacher doesn't quite see eye to eye on that. Typically, the rule is when you take people's individual freedoms away from them, you see when this is called this government overreach, and you see unintended problems occur. And that is what exactly happened, is that people were making and selling their own alcohol illegally, and it wasn't being processed in the right way. So you saw a jump in the numbers of deaths of people who were basically moonshining, and they weren't making it properly, and people were dying as a result of this. Sorry, got off on that again. Didn't mean to. Amendment 19 deals with women's suffrage, women's right to vote. Keep in mind, 1920, we're actually celebrating the 100-year anniversary of women's right to vote. So, yeah, interesting. Again, 19th Amendment made women's suffrage a part of the United States Constitution. Amendments giving women the right to vote had already been introduced, but were very unsuccessful. We talked about this, I think, a little bit in class. A majority of women actually were not in favor of giving women the right to vote. There's lots of reason for this. Many of them were they didn't want to be drafted. I think FX has a TV show. I've not seen it, so I can't recommend it. But it's called Mrs. America, and it's about one of those leading ladies who helped keep women from the right to vote. Like I said, that didn't change until 1920. In the 19th Amendment. 20th Amendment was about the convening of Congress, the inauguration of the president, vice president. Not particularly all that interesting. Amendment 22 limited the presidential tenure. You may remember in other history classes, basically the precedent was set through George Washington that when you were president of the United States, you'd serve 2 terms. That was not in writing. That just became tradition. Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, he was the first one to explore presidency through a 3rd term in office. He was unsuccessful in that, but his descendant, one of his, I believe it was a nephew, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he was elected 4 terms. Now, a lot of people will make this argument. It's like, okay, 4 terms is elected. That must show you exactly why he's maybe the most successful or most popular president in history. Well, he was so popular that after he was elected 4 times, that immediately after his death, they created the 22nd Amendment to basically put into law, nope, nobody's allowed to do this again. That was such a terrible experience for America that we're going to change the law. We're going to add this amendment so that people could not serve more than 2 terms. Okay, so that was set in, that precedent was set in 1951. Amendment 23 was put into place in 1961. This is about presidential electors for Washington, D.C. 1964, Amendment 24 was the abolition of poll taxes. Amendment 25 dealt with presidential and vice presidential succession. And then Amendment 26, this one might be a little bit important to you. Amendment 26 deals with the suffrage of citizens 18 years of age and older. So the mindset was, because at that time you had to be 21 in order to vote. But that changed in 1971 because people started thinking, okay, well, if you can be drafted at the age of 18, shouldn't you have some opinion? Shouldn't you be able to place your vote? And so that was changed based on that mindset and mentality. Now, there's some debate going on. Should this be lowered even less? I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's a good idea. I think that sets a precedent that's not good. Now, I know some of you all may disagree on that, but looking at this constitutionally, there's an argument that, okay, maybe this is where it needs to be. It doesn't need to be lowered. If anything, it could be raised, but I like the argument too. If you can serve your country, if you can die for your country, 18 seems like a pretty reasonable time to be able to vote. And then Amendment 27 deals with the restrictions on changes in congressional salary. This just meant that Congress can't just raise its own salary anytime it wants. It put restrictions on that. They still are capable of doing it, but there's more restrictions to it. All right, guys, I told you all that I try to keep this as short as possible, and I hope we accomplish that. It deals like you're looking through this chapter, you're looking through all of this, and it's like, oh man, there's so much to deal with when it comes to the Bill of Rights. The quiz should not be extremely difficult, but I did want to go over that as much as possible. Now, depending on when school year actually ends, this may be the last section of what we're going to discuss and talk about in class. Your tests will be issued via email, and you can fill those out whenever you want, and you'll send those back into me. My wife's shown me a really nice way to do tests, and I did that with your Bible class. I'm going to attempt to do that with this one as well, but you'll fill that out, turn it in. That should be the end. The only other thing you have for this class is your projects. Some of you guys are still asking me about the projects. Let me just go ahead and address that really quickly right now. Your projects are still due by the end of the year. Whatever the last day of school is, that's when your projects are due. You will email me the report that you're supposed to write, meeting all of the obligations on that, all of the guidelines that I put on that. And then the project itself, obviously, it's going to be hard to do. Now, maybe some of you guys have already completed like a physical project, and that's perfectly acceptable. Take pictures of that and send it to me. But if you're still trying to figure out, okay, well, what can I do to make this a little bit more easy to follow? You can put together a slideshow or some sort of digital presentation, and I'll accept that as well. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to be really lenient. As long as I see that you put some effort into this and you've described what you were supposed to go over. Now, I don't remember what everybody selected as far as what parts of the Constitution that they were going to do their presentations on. So if you have any questions about that, send me an email and we will discuss it, and I will show you and tell you exactly what I'm expecting. So that way you can meet those requirements. All right. I think that's it for me. Feel free to text me or email me if you have any questions. All right. You guys have a great afternoon. God bless you all. I'll tell you what, let me close you in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father God, I know that when we're dealing with politics and government and Constitution, it gets a little muddy at times. God, I know that even sometimes when I think I clearly understand something, there's something complex that I don't always get. God, my prayer is that all of these students will be able to approach their rights, their freedoms, to approach how government works, and they will have confidence in those things. So that way they can be able to hold others accountable, to hold their government accountable, hold themselves accountable. God, we know that man's law is not equal to your law, but we are grateful that we live in a country where our laws were at least originally based on your law and your standard for our lives. God, we pray for our country, pray for our nation during this difficult time. We worship and celebrate you even during these difficult times, and we praise your name. It's in your precious name we pray. Amen. All right. God bless you guys. Have a great afternoon.